I'm not quite sure if when I surpass 9 fragile states indexes or indices, whether the 10th is free, but I guess we'll
You have a little card that you're putting
yes, we'll get a punch card. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think at the outset, we can sum up the past year by saying, what a year. For many of us, 2016 was a tumultuous year, highlighted by the US presidential election, Brexit, an attempted coup in Turkey, terrorist attacks in France and Belgium, a presidential impeachment in Brazil, a frankly bizarre presidential scandal in South Korea, disputed elections in Gabon and the Gambia, and deeply worsening unrest in South Africa and Venezuela. But before going on, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the UN Foundation and Aaron for kindly hosting the Fragile States Index launch here again in your wonderful space. Our Board of Trustees, led by George Lehner, for your support, and to our new media partners, the Cipher Brief, for providing some excellent independent analysis on our findings this year. I would also like to especially thank the Fund for Peace team for the enormous undertaking that is the Fragile States Index. What is even more astonishing about this effort, I think, is that this year we have managed to release the Fragile States Index an entire month earlier than ever before, meaning that we are getting you this data when it's the freshest it's ever been. So thank you to Nate Haken and Hannah Blythe, who led the data analysis for that incredible achievement. State fragility affects us all. For people living in fragile states, fragility has an impact on their daily lives, from health to economic opportunity, to provision of public services, to justice, human rights, and even basic human security. But fragile states also have an effect on people living in more stable states. Poorly governed spaces can be havens for organised crime or terrorism. Weak states can be ill-prepared or thoroughly unable to handle public health epidemics, leading to dangerous outbreaks of pandemics, such as Ebola, being only a short plane ride away, and flows of refugees escaping poverty, conflict, or authoritarianism can place enormous strain on neighbouring countries, or even countries on the other side of the world, with the flow-on political ramifications that we've seen particularly in Europe recently. Even recognising that state fragility is important, measuring state fragility is less straightforward. Firstly, we have to define the aspects of a state that we believe point to fragility, or conversely, stability. The Fragile States Index uses a set of indicators that was developed in the 1990s under the leadership of Dr. Pauline Baker, President Emeritus of the Fund for Peace, as part of the Caste Conflict Assessment Framework that to this day continues to be used widely by policymakers and practitioners in the field who wish to analyse conflict in a structured fashion. The caste indicators focus on the social, economic, and political pressures experienced by countries. You see them on your screen now. Security apparatus, factionalised elites, group grievance, economic decline and poverty, uneven economic development, human flight and brain drain, state legitimacy, public services, human rights and the rule of law, demographic pressures, refugees and IDPs, and external intervention. But then how do you measure concepts like factionalised elites or group grievance? The Fragile States Index is unique in its ability to take qualitative content and extract out of it quantitative data. Using the indicators established by the CAST framework, we begin by a process of content analysis, whereby we analyse roughly 50 million articles, reports, and documents that have been aggregated from over 10,000 sources worldwide. Using Boolean search strings and algorithms, we are able to determine what we call saliency for each of those hundreds of search terms, for each indicator, for each country. We then cross-reference those provisional scores with pre-existing quantitative data sets that we normalise and scale, and then compare with the provisional scores from the content analysis. Depending on the degree to which the content analysis and quantitative analysis agree, the provisional scores are confirmed, or where they disagree, they are reconciled based on a set of rules that dictate allowable movements in score. As the third step in this triangulated process, a team of social science researchers independently reviews each of the 178 countries, comparing any changes in score with events recorded for each country for that time period. In essence, providing validation of the accuracy of the content analysis and quantitative data analysis streams. This triangulated process recognizes that every data set and approach has different strengths and weaknesses, and ensures that the scores we apportion are representative of multiple approaches and types of data. Now on to our findings. The 2017 index may, on first glance, look not too dissimilar to 2016 or 2015. South Sudan and Somalia continue to score highest at the top of the index, and Scandinavia collectively buttresses the bottom of the index, remembering, of course, that on the Fragile States Index, the higher the score, the higher the assessed level of fragility. But below the surface, the short and long-term trends are significantly more informative. The most worsened countries for 2017 are Ethiopia and Mexico. Ethiopia witnessed major protests and violence against the government in Oromia and Amhara, where two of the largest ethnic groups in Ethiopia live, in response to planned expansion of Addis Ababa into neighbouring Oromia. This spiraled into a broader fight for increased political freedoms, representation, and economic and land rights. It is estimated that more than 500 people were killed in these demonstrations during a time in which the government also blocked internet access to much of the country in response to the unrest. The worsening in Ethiopia during 2016 comes in spite of improving economic trends, perhaps demonstrating that although the country has enjoyed significant economic improvement, those benefits have not been equally distributed. A familiar aspect of the conflict in Ethiopia is its intersection of ethnic grievances with land competition, and in particular, a cause for land competition being tough climatic conditions, as the country faces drought and threats to the food supply. As the world continues to grapple with the potential effects of climate change, it will be important for us to recognize the manner in which those effects will manifest themselves in conflict. While much attention is given to the concept of climate change refugees, as rising sea levels threaten to swamp island nations, such as the Maldives or Kiribati, we also need to understand that climate and its effects of drought or natural disasters can have an effect on all countries, even those that, like Ethiopia, are landlocked, or like countries in West and Northwest Africa that are facing rapid desertification. Though Ethiopia's worsening this year is the culmination of a decade-long trend of increasing fragility, the trend for Mexico is less clear. Though Mexico is the equal most worsened country for 2017, this worsening actually runs counter to Mexico's long-term trend of improvement. Mexico has experienced an uptick in violence, with homicide levels not seen in 5 years. At the same time, the Mexican economy has begun to encounter headwinds, and the nation's confidence in the Peña Nieto administration continues to spiral downwards to historically low levels. All those factors combine to slow Mexico's long-term improvement on the Fragile States Index. But undoubtedly the rhetoric north of the border against Mexico and Mexicans has conspired to undermine confidence and to exacerbate tensions. But given the general trend of improvement for Mexico over the past decade, it is unclear as to whether this whether the sharp reversal will be interpreted as a new trend or simply a challenging year for the country. It was also a challenging year for Turkey, that experienced an attempted coup and a wave of reprisals against political opponents by President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The instability and resulting crackdown has served to exacerbate the country's already worsening trends on its group grievance, factionalized elites, human rights, and state legitimacy indicators. All the while as the conflict in neighbouring Syria has put enormous pressure on Turkey's security and refugee indicators. With a fractious and controversial constitutional referendum this year and greater curbs on rights and freedoms within Turkey, it is reasonable to expect that Turkey's overall trend will continue to worsen. As many of Turkey's indicator scores, including security apparatus, factionalized elites, and group grievance, have all worsened, Turkey is but one of a number of countries where we have observed a worsening of the relationship between security forces and those citizens they are meant to protect, and a link between extreme political rhetoric and scapegoating with growing strains reflected in factionalization and group grievance. Two countries where this has been especially observed are the United Kingdom and the United States. For context, when we produce the Fragile States Index every year, we produce an enormous amount of data, more than we can possibly analyze. When we look into the data, perhaps obviously, we don't tend to look closely at countries at the stable end of the index. So when the Brexit referendum occurred, after a highly divisive campaign that, let's be honest, had overtones of xenophobia and scapegoating, we decided to look into the United Kingdom's scores. What we found was alarming. Though the United Kingdom's overall trends have been generally good, hidden within those overall trends were a worsening of the key cohesion indicators. As the economic indicators improved, the cohesion indicators were running in direct reverse. The divisiveness of the Brexit campaign had clearly exploited existing, worsening social schisms within the United Kingdom and likely further exacerbated them. Incredibly, we found that the rate of change of the UK's group grievance indicator score over the past 5 years had been the 7th worst worldwide, beaten only by the likes of Syria and Libya. Upon closer inspection, we found that one country had worsened on the group grievance indicator at the same rate as the United Kingdom, the United States. Similar to the Brexit campaign, the US presidential election was heavy on divisive rhetoric. And just as in the United Kingdom, this has marked the continuation of a long-term trend of worsening group grievance and factionalized elite scores in the United States. When I previously said that we found that the US group grievance score had worsened, along with the UK, the 7th fastest for any country over the past 5 years to 2016, I should point out that in the 5 years to 2017, that rate of change is now the 4th worst in the world. To be clear, the US presidential election, as fractious as it was, has not singularly caused this decline. Rather, the data would seem to suggest that this is simply a manifestation of a longer-term trend of increasing internal tensions. As indicators worsen over time, they will have different effects on different countries. In other words, different countries have varying thresholds of tolerance for growing pressures. This resiliency is a critical aspect in understanding state fragility. The 7th most worsened country over the past decade, South Africa, is perhaps a demonstration of how relatively strong institutions can cushion the effects of increasing fragility. In the past year, South Africa has experienced increasing economic pressure that has been a major driver of strikes, protests, and political instability that has crystallized into the growing calls for President Jacob Zuma, who is also embroiled in scandal, to step down. These pressures have been accompanied by increasing economic inequality and worsening racial divisions. Though South Africa has so far demonstrated a level of resiliency, the significant worsening over the past decade has seen the country fall behind Mauritius, Seychelles, Botswana, Ghana, Cape Verde, Namibia, and Sao Tome among the continent's most stable countries. But the news is not all bad. Cuba has continued its long-term trend as the most improved country of the past decade. Meanwhile, a number of former Soviet bloc countries and former constituent states of Yugoslavia have continued strong improving trajectories over the past 10 years. Also among the most improved countries of the past 10 years are Indonesia and Colombia, where an ending to the half-century-long conflict with the FARC has begun to free the country from the significant pressures brought by internal conflict. While that brings to a close a broad overview of this year's major findings, we are often asked how people can learn more about state fragility and get more in-depth information about methodology and the scores on Fragile States Index as well as individual countries on the list. With the launch of the 2017 Fragile States Index, we are also proud to announce the release of our new Fragile States Index website at www.fragilestatesindex.org. The new platform allows for a much more interactive data experience. We are introducing the country dashboard, where we have arranged all the trend data for every country. Additionally, we have now enabled comparative analysis, which allows you to compare any set of countries by individual indicator. Perhaps the most exciting aspect of the new FSI website is the launch of My FSI. We have long been asked why we weight our indicators equally, and we recognise that no two indicators are made equal. Although weighting every indicator equally is perhaps not ideal to all users, we have long believed that to weight the indicators differently ourselves would be to make a subjective judgment on which indicators we believe to be more important or less important. So hence My FSI, which is a new app that enables you to weight each indicator based on your own perception of each indicator's importance, or based on your own research or analysis needs. The app will then chart each country's trend lines based on those revised weightings and compare it to our own published trend lines. We hope that this will be the first step in providing a new approach to data analytics and making FSI data even more useful to users. Speaking of finding ways to make FSI data more useful, we are embarking on finding ways to incorporate artificial intelligence into analysis of state fragility and conflict early warning. Even as is, FFP staff are only able to analyse the tip of the iceberg of the enormous amounts of data that we generate. What we envision for the future is the ability to harness artificial technology to analyse the data more deeply, and further to develop modelling that takes conflict early warning to the next level of being able to better model possible scenarios and to allow policymakers to better plan and react to crises when they occur. Big data, we hope, will be able to assist with high-level policy making, but we also continue to concentrate our efforts at harnessing the power of data-driven conflict early warning and analysis for local communities and on-the-ground peace-building efforts. This includes building networks of peace actors in country, such as in Nigeria, and supporting their own peace-building efforts through the use of innovative tools such as social network analysis and geotemporal mapping of conflict incidents. Through a quantitative data-driven approach to early warning and peace-building efforts, local actors are able to identify and track key conflict patterns, trends, and hotspots to inform planning and response efforts to prevent or mitigate conflict or violence. Though the Fragile States Index does not predict unrest or turmoil, it does provide early warning of the conditions that can likely give rise to instability. To that end, the short and long-term trends suggest that policymakers and practitioners should be mindful of the growing potential for the conditions of further instability in those countries, and recognise that if a shock of some variety were to occur, from a natural disaster to a recession to localised communal violence, that such events in any of these countries could have dire consequences given the pre-existing conditions of fragility. I look forward to your questions at the conclusion of the panel.